Okay, so we've defined what competition is, and then we broke it up into two classes, direct and indirect competition, right? And one of the things I think that is really critical next to think about is the idea that competition isn't always equal, right? And in fact, it's often asymmetrical, meaning one party faces a higher cost to the interaction than another. So this central concept is that competition is asymmetrical. And one of the key ideas here, right, is that even though we were looking at this matrix of types of interactions that take sort of a broad coarse graining where we say either something is negative, neutral, or positive, negative, neutral, or positive for both species, we discussed in the predation lectures that this is actually a gradient, right? Where you can imagine a gradient of interactions that run from, negative impact, let's just look at the negative ones, to zero impact, right? So over here, we have a strong negative impact on the species, and out here, we have sort of neutral, right? Strong negative impact and neutral. So rather than being a dichotomous classification, just two categories, it's a continuous classification from very negative for a given species to neutral for a species, right? And we know that we can call this sort of negative neutral amensalism. Let's actually write this word over here, amensalism, meaning one species negatively impacts the other, but the first species faces no impact of its own, right? And this is a continuum, just like all of these things we've been talking about in ecology. The sort of like classification depends on the context, right? Like whether an interaction has a net negative or a near zero impact on a species might depend on all sorts of context dependence. This is one of the key rules in ecology, right? The other one is that these interactions are largely asymmetrical, right? And so because these aren't just broad classifications of zero or negative, right? It ranges from highly negative to moderately negative. That means that some species can face a really high cost competition when another species faces a really low. And this idea means that we can end up with crazy things that happen like competitive exclusion. So your book talks about a really neat diatom example from David Tillman and colleagues. And so we can think about these graphs of diatoms. There's two diatom species, and these diatoms use a shared resource, silica, for their shells. And over time, as diatom populations grow, right, the population's growing, they're using up that silica. So this is, let's use the dashed line for species one of the diatoms and blue for the silica levels. The silica decreases as those diatoms use it up. And the same is true for species two, right? Species two of diatom grows and then also decreases silica levels on its own, right? It uses up silica. But one of the key things in this study by Tillman et al. Is that when the population of these two diatoms reaches their stable states, they reduce the silica levels to very different levels, right? So species 2 reduces it to some high level, we'll call Y, and species 1 reduces it to some low level, we'll call X, where X is much less than Y, right? And what's cool is that when you grow these species in the same container, in competition with each other, let's make a shared plot here. We start out with high silica levels, we'll draw that in blue. We start out with high silica levels, and both species are growing great, so we'll draw that part of the curve in either black dashed lines. Both species are growing great, so species 1 is growing great. When there's not low amounts of silica, species 2 is also growing great. But at a certain point, when this blue line crosses Y right there, then now species 2 no longer can get silica out of this. The silica is lower than species 2 needs for survival, and its populations start to plummet, right? Its populations start to plummet. Whereas species 1, because it can handle well-reduced silica levels, continues to grow until that silica reaches the low levels it reaches when species 1 is grown on its own, right? And so here we can actually predict which species will outcompete the other in a competitive scenario based on sort of how efficiently they use these resources, what the resource level is at the carrying capacity of that species. And in this case, a species that uses the resources more efficiently, we call this like R star, is going to outcompete the other species, right? What do you think might happen if there was another species that grew down to silica levels, Z, that are even lower, right? That species would probably outcompete the other two if it was present. And so this is the first thing, is that this is asymmetrical, right? Like this interaction has a big negative impact on the red species, and so much so that it can do this thing called competitive exclusion. This is an important idea. Where because the impact of the black species on the red species is larger than the impact of the red species on the black species outcompetes and excludes red from the ecosystem. This is the idea of competitive exclusion, right? Okay, so competition is asymmetrical. The other thing that's cool, this is an example where it's like diatoms and they're using the same shared silica resource. Another thing your book talks about is that species don't have to be closely related for them to compete, right? Humans and bacteria, for example, compete for the same resources on strawberries, right? Botrytis grows on strawberries and it rots them and uses up the sugar that I also want to eat with my kids for breakfast. A great example of this in your book was looking at competition between ants and mice for seeds. And I think why I want to highlight this example is you should know how you might study competition. So what these scientists did is they made a series of plots, a series of 4 treatments. Treatment 1 was a control, where they didn't allow any ants or any mice into a plot. Treatment 2 was a treatment where they excluded ants from the plots. Treatment 3, they excluded mice. And then treatment 4, both animals allowed. And you can probably predict what you would expect in these 4 cases if the ants and the mice were competing for resources, right? So when they excluded ants, the mice had higher biomass, they grew faster, and there were more mice. Mice did good. When they excluded mice, ants did good, right? When they had both animals in the plot, they didn't do as well as either of these two, right? They had lower biomass than the 2 treatments, right? Does that make sense? Because this is competition, both the ants did worse when the mice were present and the mice did worse when the ants were present together. When we exclude either of those 2, both parties do better. And then in the control, what was most interesting here is that they saw these ants and mice are competing for seeds, which are their food. They saw like a 450% increase in seed densities. And what's really interesting is that in these 4 treatments, or these other 3 treatments here, the seed densities were equal. And this is one of the critical things for showing competition, right? That the ants used up that 450% extra seeds when the mice weren't present, right? The mice used up all those extra seeds when the ants weren't present. Both animals consumed some set number of seeds when they were together. It was not any higher than when they were on their own, and when both were excluded, the shared resource was much higher. So this is a really good experimental design for showing that there's competition for this shared resource, right? This indirect competition for the shared resource. It's not like the mice are chasing ants off or ants are biting mice, but rather they have a shared limited resource. And this is the kind of experimental design you should really understand well for an exam, for example. Okay, nice. So that's competition is asymmetrical. We have competitive exclusion. We have the experimental design that you should understand for how to study and find competition. Nice. Also check out the Tillman above, below ground stuff in your book chapter that I'm not covering here, but that's a neat example too.